Spring arrived with a burst of activity that transformed both the garden and the household dynamic. Li Wei's carefully tended bulbs from the previous fall emerged as planned, creating splashes of color that Margaret would have loved. Thomas found himself taking photographs of the garden to share with his children, proud of what he and Li Wei had accomplished together. The one-year anniversary of Li Wei's arrival approached, and both of them were conscious of the milestone. What had begun as a tentative experiment in companionship had evolved into something neither had expected, a genuine partnership that enriched both their lives without requiring them to sacrifice their individual identities. The celebration of this anniversary was interrupted by unexpected news. Mrs. Chen arrived at their door one morning with tears in her eyes and papers in her hand. "My son in California wants me to move there," she announced. "His wife is pregnant with their first child, and they want me to help with the baby." Thomas and Li Wei exchanged glances. Mrs. Chen had been their bridge to friendship, their translator and cultural guide. More than that, she had become a treasured friend to both of them. "When would you leave?" Li Wei asked gently. "Next month," Mrs. Chen replied. "I am excited about grandchild, but sad to leave my friends here." This news forced Thomas and Li Wei to confront how much their world had expanded beyond just the two of them. Through Li Wei's teaching and their shared social activities, they had built connections in the community that would continue even without Mrs. Chen's guidance. "We must have farewell party," Li Wei decided. "Invite all your friends, neighbors, students from my classes. Celebrate your time here before you start new adventure." Planning Mrs. Chen's farewell party became a joint project that revealed how seamlessly Thomas and Li Wei worked together. Li Wei handled the cooking, drawing on recipes from various cultures she had learned from her diverse students. Thomas managed the logistics of inviting neighbors and arranging the backyard space for a large gathering. The party itself was a revelation. Thomas was amazed by how many people Li Wei had touched during her year in America. Her students came with their families, bringing dishes from their own cultures. Neighbors who had barely spoken to Thomas in years arrived with stories about Li Wei's kindness and helpfulness. Ahmed, the Somali engineer from Li Wei's English class, had found work partly because Li Wei had helped him practice job interviews. Elena's teenage daughter had learned to cook Chinese food from Li Wei, bridging a cultural gap with her Russian grandmother. Carlos had gained confidence in his English through Li Wei's patient encouragement. "I didn't realize how much you've been doing for people," Thomas said to Li Wei as they watched their guests mingle in the backyard. "Is not doing for people," Li Wei corrected, "is being part of community. In China, I lose this when husband die. Here I find it again." David and Sarah both attended the party with their families, and Thomas watched his children interact with Li Wei's students and his neighbors. For the first time, his offspring could see their father not as a lonely widower they needed to worry about, but as part of a vibrant community where he was valued and engaged. "Dad looks happier than I've seen him since Mom died," Sarah confided to David during the party. "Li Wei has been good for him." "She's been good for the whole neighborhood," David replied, watching Li Wei patiently help an elderly neighbor navigate the buffet table. "Look how she connects with everyone." Mrs. Chen's farewell speech was emotional. "When I first suggest Li Wei come to America, I think maybe I help two lonely people find friendship. But what happened is much more. They show all of us how to build family from choice, not just blood, how to honor past while embracing future." After the guests left and the cleanup was finished, Thomas and Li Wei sat on their front porch, tired but satisfied. "Good party," Li Wei said. "Mrs. Chen will remember." "Will you miss her?" Thomas asked. "Yes, but not like I miss China anymore," Li Wei replied thoughtfully. "Mrs. Chen helped me begin American life, but now I have my own life here. My students, my work, my friends," she smiled at Thomas. "My home." This conversation marked another milestone in their relationship. Li Wei no longer saw herself as a temporary visitor or even a permanent guest. She was home, fully integrated into a life she had helped create. Summer brought new rhythms and new challenges. Li Wei's Chinese classes expanded to include children's programs, keeping her busy with young students eager to connect with their cultural heritage. Thomas began volunteering at the community center, helping with basic maintenance and repairs, partly inspired by Li Wei's example of community involvement. Their morning tea ritual evolved to include planning their respective daily activities, sharing news from Li Wei's classes and Thomas's volunteer work. They had developed the comfortable communication style of people who know each other well, able to convey meaning with gestures and half-finished sentences. The second real test of their relationship came when Li Wei received news that her nephew in China was having marital problems. His wife had left him, and he was struggling with depression and financial difficulties. Li Wei felt torn between her loyalty to her American life and her responsibility to the young man she had helped raise. "I should go back to help him," Li Wei told Thomas one evening, her voice heavy with guilt and confusion. "For how long?" Thomas asked, though his heart was already sinking at the thought of losing her again. "Maybe long time," Li Wei admitted. "Maybe permanently. He is only family I have left, and he needs me." Thomas spent sleepless nights grappling with this possibility. He had grown so accustomed to Li Wei's presence that he couldn't imagine returning to his previous solitary existence. But he also understood family obligation and couldn't ask her to abandon someone who needed her help. "What do you want to do?" Thomas finally asked, though he dreaded her answer. "I want to help him, but I also want to stay here," Li Wei replied honestly. "I am pulled in two directions, and both choices mean hurting someone I care about." They decided that Li Wei would return to China for a month to assess her nephew's situation and determine what kind of help he truly needed. If he required long-term care, she would face a difficult decision about where her future lay. The month of Li Wei's absence was even harder for Thomas than her previous trip had been. This time he knew she might not return, and the uncertainty was agonizing. The house felt hollow without her presence, and Thomas realized how completely she had become part of his daily happiness. Li Wei's emails from China painted a complex picture. Her nephew was indeed struggling, but his problems stemmed more from poor choices than genuine need for Li Wei's care. He had hoped she might provide financial support or even bring him to America, rather than actually needing her ongoing presence. "I realize," Li Wei wrote, "that I feel more obligated than truly needed. My nephew is an adult man who must solve his own problems. I can help with advice and some money, but I cannot live his life for him." When Li Wei returned to America, Thomas was waiting at the airport with flowers and barely contained relief. Her decision to stay permanently was no longer tentative or temporary. She had chosen her life in America, not because she had no other options, but because it was where she wanted to be. "I am home," Li Wei said simply, as they drove back to the house that had become theirs, rather than just his. As they sat in their garden that evening, surrounded by plants they had nurtured together, both Thomas and Li Wei understood that they had created something unexpected and precious. They had proven that love doesn't only exist in romantic relationships, that family can be chosen as well as inherited, and that it's possible to build meaningful connections even in the later chapters of life. "1 year ago," Thomas said, "I was a lonely old man waiting for someone I didn't know. Now I can't imagine life without my friend who couldn't speak a word when she arrived." Li Wei smiled. "And I was frightened woman leaving everything familiar. Now I know that home is not place you come from, but place where people know your heart." Their story had become one of chosen family, cultural bridging, and the quiet miracle of two people finding exactly what they needed in each other, even when they hadn't known they were looking for it. In a world that often seemed divided by differences, Thomas and Li Wei had built a bridge of understanding that enriched not only their own lives, but their entire community. Thomas Mitchell sat in his empty kitchen, stirring his morning coffee with a spoon that clinked against the ceramic mug like a lonely bell. The sound echoed through the house that had been silent for 3 years now, ever since Margaret passed away. At 62, Thomas had grown tired of the silence, tired of talking to himself, and tired of eating dinner alone while watching the evening news. The idea of remarrying had seemed impossible at first. How could anyone replace Margaret? They had been married for 35 years, raised 2 children together, and built a life that felt complete. But as the months turned into years, Thomas realized he wasn't looking for a replacement. He was looking for companionship, someone to share his remaining years with, someone to bring warmth back into his cold house. His daughter Sarah had suggested online dating, but Thomas felt too old for such modern approaches. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman from his church who had a reputation for successful matchmaking. She had introduced several widowers to suitable women over the years, and Thomas trusted her judgment more than he trusted computer algorithms. Mrs. Henderson listened patiently as Thomas explained what he was looking for. He wanted someone kind, someone who enjoyed simple pleasures like gardening and reading, someone who wouldn't mind his morning routine of feeding the birds in his backyard. He wasn't looking for passion or romance like a young man might seek. He wanted peace, companionship, and someone to grow old with gracefully. After several weeks of consideration, Mrs. Henderson called with exciting news. She had found the perfect match for Thomas. Elena Rodriguez was a 58-year-old woman who had recently moved to their small town from Mexico. She was a widow herself, having lost her husband 2 years earlier. Mrs. Henderson explained that Elena was gentle, hard-working, and shared Thomas's love for quiet living. There was one detail that Mrs. Henderson mentioned almost casually, as if it were a minor footnote. Elena spoke very little English. She was taking classes at the community center, but communication might be challenging at first. Thomas paused when he heard this, but Mrs. Henderson quickly assured him that love transcends language barriers. She reminded him of her own grandparents, who had spoken different languages when they first met but built a beautiful marriage that lasted 60 years. Thomas found himself intrigued rather than discouraged. Perhaps it would be refreshing to have someone who couldn't fill every moment with chatter. Margaret had been a wonderful woman, but she had loved to talk, often filling the silence with observations about the neighbors, stories from her book club, or plans for redecorating various rooms in the house. The idea of comfortable silence, of communicating through gestures and smiles rather than words, seemed almost romantic to Thomas. The arrangement was made through letters, with Mrs. Henderson serving as translator. Elena would come to live with Thomas as his wife, and they would build a new life together. Thomas spent weeks preparing his house, cleaning rooms that hadn't been touched since Margaret's death, buying new curtains for the guest bedroom, and stocking the kitchen with foods he thought a Mexican woman might enjoy. He found himself nervous but excited as the wedding day approached. The ceremony would be small, held at the church with just a few close friends and family members present. Sarah had flown in from Chicago, though she had expressed concerns about her father marrying a stranger. His son David had been more supportive, reminding Sarah that their father deserved happiness and companionship in his golden years. The night before the wedding, Thomas lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what his life would look like in a week, a month, a year. Would they learn to communicate? Would they find common ground beyond their shared experience of loss? Would the house feel warm again, filled with the presence of another person? He thought about Margaret and felt a pang of guilt as if he were betraying her memory. But then he remembered her words during her final days in the hospital. She had made him promise not to spend his remaining years alone, not to become one of those bitter old men who let grief consume them. She had wanted him to find happiness again, even if it meant finding it with someone else. The morning of the wedding arrived gray and drizzly, typical weather for their small Pennsylvania town in early November. Thomas dressed carefully in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Margaret's funeral 3 years earlier. He adjusted his tie in the mirror and was surprised to see that he looked younger somehow, as if the prospect of companionship had already begun to heal something inside him. At the church, Mrs. Henderson bustled around making final arrangements. She had picked up Elena from the bus station the previous evening and had kept her overnight at her own house, following the old tradition that the bride and groom shouldn't see each other before the ceremony. Thomas found himself pacing nervously in the church vestibule, checking his watch every few minutes. Sarah arrived with her husband and 2 teenage children, who seemed more interested in their phones than in their grandfather's wedding. David came alone, having recently divorced himself, and offered Thomas words of encouragement and support. The small gathering of friends from church took their seats, whispering quietly among themselves about the unusual circumstances of the marriage. As the organ began to play, Thomas took his place at the altar beside Pastor Williams, who had agreed to perform the ceremony, despite some reservations about the arranged nature of the marriage. Thomas's hands trembled slightly as he waited, his heart beating faster than it had in years. He was about to meet his bride for the first time, the woman who would share his home, his meals, his remaining years on earth. The church doors opened and Mrs. Henderson appeared, beaming with satisfaction at her successful matchmaking. She nodded to Thomas and stepped aside, making way for the bride who would change his life forever. Thomas straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath, and prepared to greet the woman who would help him write the final chapters of his story. Elena appeared in the church doorway, and Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. She was smaller than he had expected, barely reaching his shoulder in height, with graying dark hair pulled back into a simple bun. Her dress was a modest navy blue, clearly the best she owned, but far from fancy. What struck Thomas most were her eyes, large, dark, and filled with a mixture of nervousness and determination that he recognized in himself. But as Elena walked slowly down the aisle, Thomas noticed something that Mrs. Henderson hadn't mentioned in their conversations. Elena's left hand gripped a simple wooden walking stick, and her gait was uneven, as if each step required careful consideration. She moved with the deliberate pace of someone whose body had been tested by hardship. Yet there was dignity in her bearing that commanded respect. When Elena reached the altar, she looked up at Thomas with those expressive dark eyes, and he saw something that made his heart skip. There was kindness there, a gentleness that reminded him of his mother's eyes when she used to comfort him as a child. Elena gave him a small, nervous smile and nodded slightly, as if to say she was ready to begin this new chapter of their lives together. Pastor Williams began the ceremony, speaking slowly and clearly so that Elena might understand some of the English words. Thomas found himself studying his bride's face, noticing the small scar above her left eyebrow, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, the calluses on her hands that spoke of years of hard work. These details made her real to him in a way that Mrs. Henderson's descriptions never could. When it came time for the vows, Elena had prepared something in broken English, clearly practiced many times. Her voice was soft and musical, heavily accented but sincere, as she promised to be a faithful wife and companion. Thomas was moved by the effort she had made to speak his language on their wedding day, and he responded with his own vows, speaking more slowly than usual and using simple words he hoped she would understand. The ring ceremony proved to be the first small challenge of their marriage. Thomas had bought a simple gold band, but when he tried to place it on Elena's finger, he discovered that her hands were swollen, likely from arthritis or years of manual labor. The ring wouldn't fit over her knuckle. For a moment, both of them stood there awkwardly, unsure what to do. Then Elena smiled, a real smile this time, and guided Thomas to place the ring on her middle finger instead. It was a small adaptation, but it felt like their first successful communication as husband and wife. After the ceremony, the small reception was held in the church basement. Sarah had arranged for a simple cake and coffee, though she remained distant and polite rather than warm toward her new stepmother. Elena sat quietly at the head table, observing the conversations she couldn't fully understand, occasionally nodding when someone addressed her directly. Thomas noticed how carefully she watched people's faces, as if trying to read meaning from expressions and gestures rather than words. Mrs. Henderson served as translator when necessary, but Thomas began to realize just how limited their communication would be. When Elena tried to thank Sarah for the beautiful cake, the conversation became a complex dance of gestures, simple English words, and Mrs. Henderson's interpretations. Thomas saw frustration flicker across his daughter's face and worry begin to creep into his own mind. The drive home was quiet, with Elena sitting beside Thomas in his old pickup truck, her walking stick propped between her knees. She gazed out the window at the unfamiliar landscape of her new home, occasionally pointing to something that caught her interest. A red barn, a flock of geese flying south, an old cemetery on a hill. Thomas found himself trying to imagine what she was thinking, whether she was having second thoughts about this strange arrangement. When they arrived at Thomas's house, Elena stood on the front porch for a long moment, taking in the details of what would now be her home. The house was a modest two-story colonial built in the 1940s, with white siding and black shutters that Thomas had painted himself the previous spring. Elena nodded approvingly and said something in Spanish that sounded positive, though Thomas had no idea what it meant. Inside, Thomas gave Elena a tour of the house, pointing to rooms and speaking their names slowly. "Kitchen," he said, gesturing around the room where they would share their meals. "Living room," he continued, showing her the space with its worn but comfortable furniture and the recliner where he spent most of his evenings. When they reached the staircase, Elena paused, clearly assessing whether she could manage the climb with her walking stick. Thomas had prepared the guest bedroom for Elena, assuming she would want her own space initially. He had bought new sheets, a warm quilt, and even a small vase of flowers for the nightstand. When he showed her the room, Elena looked around carefully, then said something in Spanish while gesturing between the guest room and what was obviously the master bedroom down the hall. Mrs. Henderson had given Thomas a basic Spanish phrase book as a wedding gift, and he fumbled through it now trying to understand what Elena was asking. Finally, through a combination of pointing and simple words, he realized she was asking if she should sleep in the guest room or if he expected her to share his bedroom. The question hung in the air between them, highlighting just how much they didn't know about each other's expectations. Thomas felt his face redden as he tried to communicate that she should take whatever room made her comfortable, that there was no pressure, that they could figure out these arrangements as they went along. Elena studied his face carefully, seeming to read his sincerity, then pointed to the guest room and nodded. She would start there, but her expression suggested this might not be a permanent arrangement. As evening approached, Thomas faced the challenge of preparing dinner for two people with completely different cultural backgrounds and food preferences. He had stocked up on rice and beans, thinking these might be familiar to Elena, but he quickly realized he had no idea how to prepare them the way she might be accustomed to eating them. Elena watched him fumble around the kitchen for a few minutes, then gently took over, gesturing for him to sit at the table while she worked. Watching Elena cook was like watching a dance. Despite her physical limitations, she moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, somehow transforming his simple ingredients into something that smelled wonderful. She used spices he didn't recognize, probably from a small bag she had brought with her belongings, and her hands worked with the confidence of someone who had been cooking for decades. When they sat down to eat together for the first time as husband and wife, Thomas was surprised by how natural it felt. The food was delicious, far better than anything he had made for himself in 3 years of widowed cooking. Elena watched his face as he tasted her cooking, and when he smiled and said, "Very good," she beamed with pleasure. It was their first successful exchange of the day, accomplished without words but with perfect understanding. The first weeks of marriage passed in a series of small discoveries and quiet adjustments. Thomas learned that Elena woke before dawn, moving carefully through the house to avoid disturbing him as she prepared coffee in the kitchen. He would find her each morning sitting at the kitchen table, rosary beads in her hands, lips moving silently in prayer as the sun rose through the window. She never tried to wake him or make him join her devotions, but there was something peaceful about knowing she was there, adding warmth to the morning routine. Elena's physical limitations became more apparent as Thomas observed her daily struggles. Her left leg was clearly weaker than her right, and she favored her left arm when lifting anything heavy. Climbing the stairs was a slow process that required both hands on the railing and careful placement of each step. Thomas began to understand why Mrs. Henderson might have failed to mention these details. Elena's disabilities were real, but they didn't define her. She adapted to each challenge with quiet determination, never complaining or asking for help unless absolutely necessary. Communication remained their biggest challenge. Thomas had started carrying the Spanish phrase book everywhere, but conversations were exhausting puzzles that left both of them frustrated. When Elena tried to tell him something important about a leak she had discovered under the kitchen sink, it took 20 minutes of pointing, gesturing, and flipping through the phrase book before Thomas understood what she was trying to say. By then, water had been dripping onto the floor for hours, but they also began to develop their own system of communication. Elena would touch Thomas's arm and point when she wanted to show him something. Thomas learned that her raised eyebrows meant she was asking a question, while her slight nod and smile meant approval. When she cooked, she would taste the food and then offer the spoon to Thomas, watching his face for his reaction. These wordless exchanges became their first shared language. The neighbors were curious about Thomas's new wife, and their reactions varied widely. Mrs. Patterson from next door brought over a casserole and tried to engage Elena in conversation, speaking very loudly and slowly as if volume would overcome the language barrier. Elena smiled politely and nodded, but Thomas could see the discomfort in her eyes. Mr. Johnson from across the street was more direct, asking Thomas outright if he was sure he knew what he was getting into, marrying a woman he couldn't even talk to properly. Sarah called every few days, ostensibly to check on her father, but really to voice her growing concerns about the marriage. She worried that Elena was taking advantage of Thomas, that he was too lonely to see clearly, that the language barrier would prevent him from knowing if something was wrong. Thomas tried to reassure his daughter, but he began to wonder himself if he had made a mistake during the long evenings when he and Elena sat in the living room together, each absorbed in their own activities, the silence stretching between them like an ocean. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late November. Thomas had been working in his workshop in the basement, building a small shelf for Elena to display the few photographs she had brought from Mexico. When he came upstairs, he found Elena collapsed on the kitchen floor, her walking stick lying beside her, groceries scattered around her from the bag she had been carrying when she fell. For a terrifying moment, Thomas thought she might be seriously injured or having a heart attack. But as he knelt beside her, Elena opened her eyes and tried to sit up, clearly embarrassed by her weakness. Her face was pale, and Thomas could see that her bad leg had given out completely. She said something in rapid Spanish, probably apologizing or trying to explain what had happened, but Thomas couldn't understand a word. Instead of reaching for the phrase book or trying to communicate with words, Thomas simply helped Elena to a chair and began checking her for injuries. He examined her arms and legs carefully, relieved to find no broken bones or serious cuts. Elena watched his face as he worked, and something passed between them in that moment, a recognition that care and concern needed no translation. Thomas made Elena tea and insisted she rest while he cleaned up the scattered groceries and mopped the water from her wet shoes off the floor. When he brought her the tea, Elena caught his hand and held it for a moment, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She said gracias so softly he almost didn't hear it, but the gratitude in her voice was unmistakable. That evening, Thomas called Mrs. Henderson and asked her to come over to help translate a conversation he needed to have with Elena. When Mrs. Henderson arrived, Thomas explained about Elena's fall and his concerns about her safety in the house. Through Mrs. Henderson's translation, he learned that Elena had been struggling with her physical limitations more than she had wanted to admit. The stairs were difficult, the grocery shopping was exhausting, and she had been too proud to ask for help. But the conversation revealed something more important. Elena told Mrs. Henderson that despite their communication problems, she felt safer and more cared for than she had since her first husband died. In Mexico, she had been living with her sister's family, sleeping on a couch and feeling like a burden. Here she had her own space, her own role as Thomas's wife, and the respect that came with that position. She wasn't ready to give up on their marriage, even if it was more challenging than either of them had expected. Thomas found himself deeply moved by Elena's words. He realized that he had been so focused on their inability to talk that he had overlooked all the ways they were successfully sharing a life together. Elena kept the house cleaner than it had been since Margaret died. She cooked meals that turned the kitchen into a warm, inviting space filled with wonderful smells. She fed the birds in the backyard every morning, something Thomas had neglected in recent months, and had somehow convinced them to come closer to the house than they ever had before. That night, as Thomas prepared for bed, he made a decision. He couldn't learn Spanish quickly at his age, and Elena's English was improving slowly. But they didn't need perfect communication to build a life together. They needed patience, kindness, and the willingness to keep trying. He thought about Margaret and realized she would have approved of Elena. Both women had the same quality of making a house feel like a home, of bringing out the best in the people around them. Before going to sleep, Thomas knocked gently on Elena's door. When she opened it, he handed her a small bell that he had found in Margaret's sewing box. Through gestures and simple words, he explained that she should ring it if she needed help, especially if she fell again or felt unwell. Elena understood immediately and smiled, the first truly happy smile he had seen from her since their wedding day. As November turned to December, their daily routines began to mesh more smoothly. Thomas started doing the grocery shopping, while Elena took over more of the cooking and household tasks that didn't require climbing stairs. They developed a system for watching television together, with Elena asking questions through gestures and Thomas trying to explain the plots of shows or the news stories they watched. It wasn't perfect communication, but it was communication nonetheless. December brought the first real test of their growing partnership. Thomas had always been someone who enjoyed Christmas, but the holiday had become a painful reminder of loss since Margaret's death. The decorations stayed in boxes, the tree remained unbought, and Christmas Day passed like any other day, marked only by awkward phone calls from his children and the weight of memories. Elena seemed to sense the significance of the approaching holiday, though Thomas wasn't sure how much she understood about American Christmas traditions. She began staying up later in the evenings, working on something at the kitchen table after Thomas had gone to watch television. When he asked what she was doing, she would smile mysteriously and cover her work with a dish towel, clearly planning some kind of surprise. The mystery was solved on a snowy Saturday morning when Thomas woke to find Elena in the living room, carefully arranging small figures on the mantelpiece. She had been creating a nativity scene, hand-carved from pieces of wood she must have found in his workshop. The figures were simple but beautiful, each one shaped with obvious care and painted with small bottles of craft paint she had somehow acquired during one of their trips to town. Thomas stood in the doorway watching Elena work, moved by the concentration on her face and the reverence with which she handled each small figure. When she noticed him watching, she gestured for him to come closer and pointed to each figure, speaking their names in Spanish. "Jose," she said, holding up the figure of Joseph. "Maria," she continued with Mary. "El Niño Jesús," she whispered, cradling the tiny baby figure in her palms. The nativity scene transformed the living room in a way that Thomas hadn't expected. It wasn't just decoration. It was Elena's way of sharing her faith and her culture with him, of making their house feel like home for both of them. Thomas found himself stopping to look at the small scene throughout the day, impressed by the skill and devotion that had gone into creating it. That afternoon, Thomas made a decision that surprised him. He asked Elena if she would like to help him pick out a Christmas tree. Her face lit up with excitement, and she clapped her hands together like a child who had just been offered a wonderful gift. They drove to the tree farm on the edge of town. Elena bundled in one of Margaret's old coats that Thomas had offered her when the weather turned cold. Choosing a tree became an adventure in communication and compromise. Elena preferred a tall, full tree that reminded Thomas of the enormous trees his family had always chosen when he was young. Thomas was thinking more practically about fitting it through the door and finding ornaments to fill its branches. They walked through the rows of trees together, Elena leaning heavily on her walking stick in the snow, but refusing Thomas's suggestion that they take the truck closer to the trees. When they found a tree they both liked, Thomas was touched to see Elena run her hands over its branches, breathing in the scent of pine with her eyes closed. She said something in Spanish that he didn't understand, but her expression told him she was remembering other Christmas trees, other holidays, perhaps with her first husband, or her children back in Mexico. For a moment, Thomas felt like an intruder in her memory, but then Elena opened her eyes and smiled at him, including him in whatever happiness she was recalling. Setting up the tree in their living room became a project that required both of their skills. Thomas handled the physical work of mounting the tree in its stand and stringing the lights, while Elena directed the placement with gestures and occasional words of approval or concern. When Thomas brought down the boxes of ornaments that had been stored in the attic since Margaret's death, Elena examined each one carefully, as if she were learning about his family's history through their Christmas decorations. Some of the ornaments were handmade gifts from his children when they were young, construction paper angels and popsicle stick, stars that Margaret had insisted on saving every year. Others were delicate glass balls that had belonged to Thomas's mother. Elena handled each one with respect, asking through gestures about their significance and listening carefully to Thomas's simple explanations. The most meaningful moment came when Elena disappeared upstairs and returned with a small, wooden star that she had clearly carved herself. It was painted gold and decorated with tiny dots that might have been meant to represent jewels. She held it up and looked at Thomas questioningly, and he understood immediately that she wanted to put it at the top of their tree. Thomas lifted Elena so she could reach the highest branch, supporting her carefully as she placed her star in the position of honor. That evening, they sat together in the living room with only the Christmas tree lights illuminating the space. The combination of Elena's nativity scene and their decorated tree created an atmosphere of peace and celebration that Thomas hadn't felt in years. Elena had made hot chocolate using a recipe that involved cinnamon and other spices Thomas couldn't identify, and they sat sipping their drinks in comfortable silence, watching the lights twinkle on the tree. Sarah called that evening to check on her father, and for the first time since his remarriage, Thomas felt genuinely happy to talk about his new wife. He told Sarah about the nativity scene, about choosing the tree together, about Elena's hand-carved star topping their Christmas tree. There was something in his voice that must have convinced Sarah that her father was truly content, because she asked to speak to Elena directly. The phone conversation between Sarah and Elena was halting and difficult, with Thomas serving as translator for both women. But by the end of the call, Sarah had managed to convey her gratitude for Elena's care of her father, and Elena had expressed her joy at being part of Thomas's family. It wasn't a perfect conversation, but it was a beginning. Christmas Eve brought a snowstorm that blanketed their small town in white silence. Thomas and Elena spent the day cooking together, preparing a meal that combined American and Mexican traditions in ways that surprised both of them. Elena taught Thomas to make tamales, patiently showing him how to spread the masa and fold the corn husks, while Thomas shared his mother's recipe for sugar cookies, guiding Elena's hands as she used the cookie cutters. That evening, Elena asked Thomas to attend midnight mass with her at the Catholic church across town. Thomas hadn't been to a Catholic service since he was a child visiting his grandmother, but he found himself moved by Elena's quiet faith and her desire to share this important tradition with him. They sat together in the candlelit church, Elena's lips moving silently in prayers Thomas couldn't understand, but feeling connected to something larger than their individual loneliness. After Mass, they drove home through the snowy streets, the Christmas tree lights glowing in windows throughout their neighborhood. Thomas felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since before Margaret's illness, a sense that his life had found its direction again. Elena reached over and touched his hand as they pulled into their driveway, and Thomas realized that somewhere in the past month, they had stopped being strangers who happened to share a house and had become partners building a life together. The new year brought unexpected challenges that tested the foundation of trust Thomas and Elena had been building. In January, Elena received a letter that arrived with foreign stamps and her sister's familiar handwriting. Thomas watched Elena's face change as she read the letter, her expression shifting from joy to worry to something that looked like fear. When she finished reading, Elena sat at the kitchen table for a long time, the letter clutched in her hands, tears streaming down her face. Thomas tried to comfort her, offering tissues and attempting to ask what was wrong through their limited shared vocabulary. But Elena seemed unable or unwilling to explain, simply shaking her head and retreating to her room for the rest of the day. Thomas was left feeling helpless and excluded, wondering if the letter contained news that might take Elena away from him, or change their life together in ways he couldn't control. The next few days were tense and uncomfortable. Elena moved through the house like a ghost, performing her usual tasks but without her normal cheerfulness. She barely ate the meals she prepared, and Thomas caught her several times staring out the window with tears in her eyes. At night, he could hear her moving around in her room, clearly unable to sleep. Thomas felt the return of the loneliness he had experienced before Elena arrived, but now it was worse because she was physically present but emotionally distant. Finally, Thomas called Mrs. Henderson and asked her to come over to help translate whatever crisis Elena was facing. When Mrs. Henderson arrived and began speaking with Elena in Spanish, the conversation was long and emotional. Elena cried as she explained the contents of the letter, occasionally gesturing toward Thomas with expressions of worry and apology. When Mrs. Henderson finally turned to explain the situation to Thomas, her face was grave. Elena's oldest son, Carlos, had been in a serious car accident in Mexico. He was alive but badly injured, facing months of recovery and expensive medical bills that the family couldn't afford. Elena's sister was asking for financial help, but more than that, she was telling Elena that the family needed her to come home to help care for Carlos and his 3 young children while he recovered. The weight of this news settled over Thomas like a heavy blanket. Elena had children and grandchildren in Mexico who needed her, family obligations that he had no part in and no right to interfere with. Mrs. Henderson explained that Elena was torn between her duty to her blood family and her commitment to her new husband. She felt guilty for bringing this burden into Thomas's life, but she also felt guilty for being so far away when her family was in crisis. Thomas spent that night lying awake, wrestling with emotions he hadn't expected to feel so strongly. Somewhere over the past few months, Elena had become essential to his daily happiness in ways that surprised him. The thought of losing her, of returning to the empty house and silent meals, filled him with a panic that had nothing to do with loneliness and everything to do with love. He had fallen in love with his wife without realizing it. Not the passionate love of youth, but the deep, comfortable love of companionship and shared purpose. The next morning, Thomas made a decision that would have seemed impossible to him 6 months earlier. He told Elena through gestures and simple words that he wanted to help her family. He had savings that he rarely touched, money that was meant for his own old age and medical expenses. But what good was financial security if the person who made his life worth living was suffering? Mrs. Henderson returned to help facilitate a longer conversation about practical matters. Thomas learned that Carlos's medical bills would cost several $1,000s, money that Elena's family simply didn't have. Thomas also learned that Elena felt obligated to return to Mexico temporarily to help with Carlos's care and to take care of her grandchildren while their father recovered. Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, by offering to pay Carlos's medical expenses and to go to Mexico with Elena if she would have him. Mrs. Henderson translated this offer with obvious shock, and Elena's reaction was immediate and emotional. She threw her arms around Thomas, sobbing with relief and gratitude, speaking rapidly in Spanish through her tears. The practical arrangements for traveling to Mexico were more complicated than Thomas had anticipated. His passport had expired years earlier, and Elena's legal status in the United States required careful attention to ensure she could return without problems. They spent weeks visiting government offices, filling out forms, and waiting for approvals that seemed to take forever. During this time, Thomas began to understand the depth of Elena's sacrifice in coming to marry him. She had left behind not just her country but her role as a grandmother, her place in a large extended family, her position as the one family members turned to in times of crisis. By marrying Thomas and moving to Pennsylvania, Elena had given up a central role in her first life to become a peripheral figure in his world. This realization changed how Thomas thought about their marriage. He had been focused on what Elena brought to his life: companionship, cooking, warmth, care. But he began to understand what she had given up and what she continued to sacrifice by staying with him. The financial help he was offering her family wasn't generosity. It was the least he could do to honor her sacrifices. As they prepared for the trip to Mexico, Thomas experienced anxiety about traveling to a country where he didn't speak the language and would be completely dependent on Elena for communication. The roles would be reversed. He would be the one struggling to understand, the one needing protection and guidance in an unfamiliar culture. Part of him worried that once Elena was back with her family, surrounded by people she could talk to easily and children who needed her, she might decide not to return to Pennsylvania. Elena seemed to sense his worries without needing translation. She began teaching Thomas basic Spanish phrases, writing them phonetically on index cards so he could practice pronunciation. She showed him photographs of her family members, telling him their names and relationships so he would be prepared when he met them. Most importantly, she made it clear through gestures and her growing English vocabulary that she considered him her husband and that they were traveling to Mexico together, not her going home while he waited for her return. The night before their departure, Thomas and Elena sat in their living room with their suitcases packed by the door. The Christmas tree was still up, though they had removed most of the ornaments. Elena's wooden star remained at the top, catching the light from the table lamps. They held hands as they sat together, not talking but sharing the comfortable silence that had become their most successful form of communication. Thomas thought about the journey they had taken. Together since their wedding day 6 months earlier, they had learned to communicate without sharing a language, to care for each other without fully understanding each other's backgrounds, to build a partnership based on respect and daily kindness rather than passion or shared interests. Now they were about to face their biggest test: whether their marriage could survive being transplanted to Elena's world, whether Thomas could adapt to being the outsider, whether Elena would choose to return with him when her family no longer needed her immediate presence. As they prepared for bed, Elena stopped at the nativity scene she had created and said a prayer in Spanish. Thomas found himself saying his own prayer, not to any specific deity but to whatever forces in the universe had brought them together. He prayed for Carlos's recovery, for safe travels, for the strength to be the husband Elena deserved regardless of what country they were in, and for the wisdom to know how to navigate the complex loyalties and obligations that were part of loving someone with a history and family of their own. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came the first real test of Thomas and Li Wei's permanent living arrangement. The novelty of their friendship had settled into comfortable routine, but the shorter days and longer nights revealed new aspects of their personalities that hadn't been apparent during the golden days of autumn. Li Wei, Thomas discovered, became melancholy during the dark months. She would sit by the window for hours, watching the bare branches of the oak tree sway in the wind, her usual cheerfulness replaced by quiet contemplation. When Thomas asked about it, she explained that winter had always been difficult for her, especially after her husband's death. Zhang died in January, she said softly. Every winter I remember last months of his life. In China, I keep busy with teaching, but here, with no work, my mind has too much time to think. Thomas understood this kind of grief. Margaret had died in February, and for 3 years the cold months had been almost unbearable for him. But sharing the burden with someone who truly understood made it more manageable. Would it help if you found work here? Thomas suggested. Your English is much better now, and you mentioned wanting to teach again. Li Wei's face brightened at the possibility. But who would hire a Chinese woman of my age? American schools want young teachers with American education. Mrs. Chen, ever helpful, provided the answer. The community center where Li Wei took English classes was looking for someone to teach basic Chinese to adults. The pay wasn't much, but it would provide Li Wei with purpose and social connection during the dark winter months. Li Wei was nervous about the interview, but her gentle teaching style and patient nature made her a natural fit. Within a week, she was teaching 2 classes of eager students who wanted to learn Chinese for business, travel, or simply intellectual curiosity. Thomas was amazed by the transformation. The melancholy woman who had sat by the window became animated and purposeful. She spent evenings preparing lesson plans, practicing pronunciation with Thomas as her willing student, and sharing amusing stories about her students' attempts to master tonal language. Mr. Peterson. He is 75 years old and wants to learn Chinese to talk to his granddaughter's boyfriend. Li Wei laughed one evening. He cannot hear difference between tones, so he always says wrong words. Today he meant to say thank you, but said pregnant woman instead. Thomas found himself looking forward to these stories. Through Li Wei's teaching experiences, he was learning about his community's growing diversity and the small dramas of ordinary people trying to connect across cultural boundaries. Meanwhile, Thomas had his own adjustments to make. Having someone else in the house meant considering another person's needs when making decisions. He couldn't just watch whatever he wanted on television or eat dinner at odd hours. But these small sacrifices felt natural rather than burdensome. The real challenge came when Thomas caught a severe case of flu in January. For 3 days he was bedridden with fever and barely able to keep food down. Li Wei took care of him with the same patient attention she had once given her elderly mother, bringing him soup, monitoring his temperature, and quietly handling household tasks he was too weak to manage. You don't have to do this, Thomas protested weakly when Li Wei appeared with another cup of tea and fresh towels. Who else will do it? Li Wei replied matter-of-factly. This is what people do when they care about each other. Her simple statement revealed something important about their relationship. They had moved beyond polite housemates to genuine family, chosen rather than biological, but no less real for that choice. When Thomas recovered, he found himself looking at Li Wei differently. Not romantically, but with the deep appreciation that comes from being cared for during vulnerability. He had forgotten what it felt like to have someone worry about his health, to have meals prepared when he was too sick to cook, to have his well-being matter to another person. How can I repay you for taking care of me? Thomas asked once he was back on his feet. No repayment needed, Li Wei said. But maybe you help me with something. Li Wei's request surprised him. She wanted to learn to drive. At 62, she had never owned a car or learned to drive, relying on public transportation in Beijing. But American life, especially in their suburban community, required more independence than walking and buses could provide. Teaching Li Wei to drive became their winter project. Thomas was patient but sometimes nervous as Li Wei cautiously navigated empty parking lots, confused by the different rules and customs of American roads. Li Wei was determined but frustrated by her slow progress. In China, I take bus everywhere, Li Wei said after a particularly challenging lesson where she had trouble parallel parking. Driving seems so complicated. What if I hit someone? Everyone feels that way when they're learning, Thomas assured her. You're doing better than you think. The driving lessons became an unexpected source of bonding. Thomas remembered teaching his own children to drive decades earlier. The mixture of pride and terror that came with watching someone you care about take on new independence. Li Wei approached driving with the same methodical patience she brought to everything else, practicing in empty lots until she felt confident enough for quiet residential streets. By February, Li Wei had passed her driving test and purchased a small, reliable used car. Thomas felt genuine pride watching her navigate the route to the community center on her own for the first time. Her independence didn't diminish their friendship. It strengthened it by ensuring that Li Wei was choosing to share her life with Thomas, rather than depending on him out of necessity. The anniversary of Margaret's death came in late February, and Thomas wasn't sure how to handle it with Li Wei in the house. For 3 years he had spent the day alone, looking through photo albums and indulging in private grief, but this year felt different. Today is a difficult day for you, Li Wei observed at breakfast, noting Thomas's subdued mood. Thomas nodded. Margaret died 3 years ago today. Li Wei was quiet for a moment. You want to be alone to remember her? Thomas considered this. I'm not sure what I want. Li Wei made the decision for both of them. I go to work early today, stay late for extra student help. You have house to yourself for remembering. Tonight, if you want company, I am here. If you want to be alone, I understand. Her sensitivity touched Thomas deeply. Li Wei had found the perfect balance between respecting his grief and offering support without pressure. Thomas spent the day with Margaret's memory, but for the first time since her death, the remembering didn't feel like drowning. Perhaps it was Li Wei's presence in the house, even when she wasn't physically there, that made the grief feel less overwhelming. He still missed Margaret terribly, but the sharp edge of loneliness had been softened by having someone who cared about his well-being. That evening, Li Wei returned home quietly, giving Thomas space to decide whether he wanted company. He found her in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner without asking if he was hungry. Thank you, Thomas said, for understanding what I needed today. Grief never disappears, Li Wei replied, but maybe get easier when someone shares the weight. As winter slowly gave way to spring, Thomas realized that he and Li Wei had successfully navigated their first major season together. They had learned to accommodate each other's needs, support each other through difficult times, and maintain their individual identities while building something together that neither could have achieved alone.